Hey there. Let me regale you with a little story. A story about a washed up B list TV star turned Republican president who got elected on a platform of American exceptionalism and xenophobia. A president who, during his administration, stripped health care from millions of the most vulnerable Americans, put into motion a set of ever escalating events that would ultimately lead to an all out war, complete with casualties and war crimes, and openly committed treason, all the while allegedly suffering from dementia. He demonized his left-leaning opponents and fostered a nationalistic fervor among his base. He fabricated falsehoods out of thin air to justify the oppression of minorities and fed conspiracy theories about some mysterious, all-powerful cabal of opposition. He used a twisted sense of the rule of law to mass incarcerate members of the Black community and the Latino community. He blamed the poor for being poor, he was aggressively anti-union, and took steps to rob the workers of their collective bargaining rights. He facilitated shady arms deals with a murderous regime on foreign shores. He even managed to invade a sovereign nation against the wishes of the UN, I might add, and installed a colonialist government to keep those scary communists from gaining too much power. He would later go on to celebrate this invasion as a return to glory for America's long legacy of foreign interventionism. His charismatic appeal and nationalist sentiments created a cult of personality around him. And no, I'm not talking about Trump and Colt 45. Trump wishes he could do this much damage. I'm talking about Ronald Reagan. This all happened in the 80s. Yeah, this is nothing new. Let's take a deep breath. I understand your concerns. Doom is in ample supply right now. I get that. That black pill starts to look mighty friendly. Right now, we all watched a grand jury rule that it's okay for the state to gun down Black Americans in their home without consequences. A progressive-minded justice holding a seat at the highest court of the land succumbed to chronic illness, leaving the tie-breaking vote in the hands of whatever trad-con homunculus the current proto-dictator wishes to appoint. The Republican Party seems to have been taken over by far-right sentiment. The Democratic Party has shown that it would rather roll over for fascism than risk any of their own establishment power. And we have a sitting president openly flirting with the idea of taking over the government via a coup. These are trying times, no bones about it. Your fatigue, your wariness, your sadness, your outrage, your tears are all valid. But I think that I can give some historical context, and with it some encouragement and hope to keep us pushing forward. The purpose of this is not to shame you for your feelings of despair. I am not going to have a boomer moment and finger wag you little anarchities for all of your doomer posting. Instead, I wanted to shed a little more light on something that gets lost in all of the noise. The United States has weathered a dangerous rise in far-right sentiment on many occasions, and what you're doing right now, taking to the streets, putting the feet of your representatives to the fire, and taking direct action to effect change at the local and state level, that's why I truly believe that we can still win this thing. So first, I'll be candid about our current reality. The Republican Senate, Trump, and the Supreme Court are currently in a dangerous place. They have the very real capability and means to cause a lot of destruction. Rights for marginalized people may actually be under threat. I can't sugarcoat that, and I won't try to. So we'll take cuteness breaks to prevent the stress from reaching critical mass. Here's my dog. Isn't she cute? Good. So we know Trump is bad, but in terms of long-term damage to the country, he doesn't hold a candle to the face of many a Republican body pillow, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is largely responsible for the wide-scale decline in union membership across the United States in the aftermath of the air traffic controllers' strike. A union committed the crime of going on strike to secure better conditions for their workers. I should add that Reagan himself was a former union leader, having previously served as the head of the Screen Actors Guild. It should also be noted that the union, who ultimately became the first casualty in his war against the working class, was one of the only two that actually endorsed his presidency. Remember that whenever anyone suggests that leftists should try to do their own lobbying. It was a complicated series of events, but to tell the short version, the air traffic controllers went on strike. Commercial flights all but ground to a halt. A 1956 law had made strikes by federal employees illegal, and when they refused to cave to the counteroffer from the FAA and Reagan's demands to return to work, all of the striking controllers, over 11,000 in total, were terminated. This included a number of former war veterans and workers without more than a high school education. Remember, this is during a time when less than 20% of working adults held a college degree. He rapidly filled the posts with transferred workers, or those who had crossed the picket lines, military personnel, retirees, trainers, and formerly inactive controllers. It would be another 10 years before the commercial airlines industry would fully recover. The main union involved with the strike, which I'll say again, endorsed Reagan during his campaign, had its leaders arrested, lost its certification, was financially bankrupted, and ultimately dissolved. The strikers were painted as traitors to the country. And what were these horrible un-American requests that the union leaders were asking for? A 32-hour work week, 8-hour workday, and an annual pay raise. Good God, the only remaining superpower in the world could never meet such unreasonable demands. The worst part about all of this was the precedent. The resulting change in public perception, in no small part due to Reagan's smearing of the workers, would ultimately lead to many states adopting right-to-work laws. This, coupled with Reagan's slashing of corporate tax rates, meant that corporations no longer had the responsibility to cave to worker demands. Whereas previously strikes were a common occurrence and the number one way for the working class to assert their power over the bourgeoisie, now corporations were all too happy to just fire any workers who dared to strike and hire scabs as replacements. So that was about 450 words just to cover the effects of the Reagan presidency on labor, and I'm just getting started. Here's another dog pick. Take a couple breaths, because it's time to talk about mental health. So again, to speak candidly and honestly, and I'll try to keep this segment out of trigger territory, but if you want to weep in the corner for a few days, try reading about the history of the treatment of mental disorders in the United States. As a nation, our track record in this area is flawed. We'll say flawed. Even at the best of times. If you are a transgender, a woman generally unhappy with anything, or something other than heterosexual, then guess what? At some point you had a diagnosable condition that appeared in many psychiatric manuals. One that could require any number of such gyms as electroshock therapy, solitary confinement, aggressive drug regimens with questionable effectiveness, rather traumatic therapy, which at times was indistinguishable from torture. Oh, and lobotomy. Forgot about that. Any of the conditions above, along with suffering from PTSD, being on the autistic spectrum, having bipolar disorder, or just mild social anxiety could get you thrown in a straitjacket in a poorly managed facility with little to no oversight, hoping that your family, if they weren't the ones who committed you, had the resources to lobby for your release. And sometimes that didn't matter either. One of John F. Kennedy's sisters was institutionalized as a teenager for antisocial behavior and a propensity for speaking out of turn. And when I say institutionalized, I mean she was spirited away to a clinic, had a lobotomy performed on her at night before she was discreetly committed to an asylum where she lived for the rest of her life. My point being, we have a long way to go in this country for how we treat mental health issues. Which makes it all the more vile that in an effort to balance the budget, Ronald Reagan decided to repeal the majority of provisions signed just a year earlier by Jimmy Carter for mental health facilities. Whereas the bill signed by Carter allowed for federal grants to be distributed to state-run facilities, Reagan put the responsibility directly on the states. This led many of the most populous states using fiscal responsibility and the flawed history of state-run mental health facilities as justification to shut them down entirely and release the majority of their patients. Look, there is no easy way to say this. Some people are unable to provide for themselves due to mental disorder. This is an uncomfortable truth, but it should be noted, millions of former patients would be released without any support systems in place. Even if someone had the faculties to take care of themselves, they may not have had health insurance or strong familial or community support. They may have been committed and abandoned by their families. Perhaps all of their immediate family had passed away or grew old and were themselves no longer able to provide for dependents. The situations varied, but ultimately millions of patients would ultimately become homeless in the span of a year. And remember, this was in 1981, so some of these people are still on the streets to this day, abandoned by their communities, their families, and finally their government. A massive spike in the homeless population correlates perfectly with the closing of the mental facilities, along with a spike in criminality, but I am getting ahead of myself. Here, I have a dog picture. Okay, so now we can get into crime. This one's actually pretty straightforward. Reagan got the US government into the cocaine and arms trade to fund revolutionaries in the Middle East. This involved selling guns to one group to buy cocaine from the other group. And from there, it was just a matter of connecting the drug dealers with the drug consumers. Addiction ripped through black communities, but remember, during this time, there wasn't a white face on addiction. We weren't ready to accept that addiction is a disease that needs treatment, as opposed to a crime and moral failing that needs detention. And the resulting spike in crime was all of the justification needed to fuel the drug war on American communities. Black communities now had to contend with a violent black market in their own neighborhoods, as well as crippling addiction and the iron fist of over-policing all at once. Mass incarceration skyrocketed, and low-income communities were devastated. This is the catalyst that created the conditions for the wildly disproportionate amount of black men serving lengthy sentences for crimes of drug possession. Oh, I forgot all about AIDS. Yeah, Reagan basically ignored it until it hit pandemic proportions. Almost 90,000 Americans died to an illness that the president dismissed as a nuisance. An apathetic, right-wing corporatist demagogue stood by and watched tens of thousands of Americans die while fattening the coffers of his corporate buddies. Certainly no parallels to draw there. Now, why did I give you all that history on Reagan? It's nothing new or disputed among most leftist circles. Because if you had the chance to see that 8-year reign of terror happening in real time, as opposed to reading about it in history books, then you'd start to feel your own resolve slipping. Reagan did his damnedest to try and hand over America to the oligarchy. In many ways, he set back social movements for decades. He was a factually more destructive president in his first 2 years than Trump has been in his first 4. And this didn't even need to be about Reagan. I could go back farther. There were so many race riots during the turn of the century that they have their own Wikipedia page. At the beginning of the Cold War, we watched McCarthyism lead to open calls for violence against left-wing activists. But at all of these points in history, there were activists leading the charge. There were people still rising to the occasion and taking to the front lines to push for social change. Don't take this to be me saying, oh, Trump ain't that bad. Trump traffics in much of the same dangerous rhetoric. He absolutely has the means, and it seems the motive, to kill the working class and set back social justice movements. But know that if, after all of that happened, we still have the means to organize, we still have the means to effect real, tangible social change. We have a long way to go, and I look forward to getting there with you, comrades, and I truly think that we can do it. It will be a long and hard-fought battle. There will be victories and losses along the way. But I remain cautiously optimistic, and you should too. After all, we've been here before. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please click like and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me why you are going to keep fighting. Follow me on Twitch, where I play games, work on music, and give the occasional lecture. Follow me on Twitter to find clues to the hidden cipher in the frames of this video. And if you are so inclined to support future videos, I do have a Patreon. Thanks again.